Hey friend, today's video audio is going to be something a little bit different. So here's a confession. I love, but love Hallmark movies, and I'm not ashamed to say it. I love the comfort in them, the certainty of them. Like, you just know there's going to be a town fair and a handsome man who chops wood like it's a full-time emotional expression. And at some point, someone will definitely say the line, "You've changed since you came back from the city." And because my brain is wired the way it is, whenever I find something I love, my first instinct is, like, how can I Tudorfy this? So today, we are doing exactly that. This, my friend, is something new I'm trying. You might hate it, you might love it. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm giving it a try. It's a cozy, cinnamon-scented, falling leaves, Tudor-era Hallmark romance. There will be spice merchants. There will be parish gossip. There will be at least one emotionally complicated blacksmith with a strong jawline and unresolved feelings about London. So, grab a warm drink, something autumnal, and settle in because this, my friend, is A Tudor Autumn Romance. I'm bringing Hallmark to Tudor England. Welcome to Chapter 1, Cinnamon and Smoke. And we begin in the village of Hartwell. The first chill of Michaelmas had just settled over Hartwell, the kind that nipped at fingertips and made the breath of every passerby bloom in pale clouds above the muddy lane. The leaves along the hedgerows had begun their annual surrender, turning shades of amber and rust before dropping into the ruts carved by cartwheels. Smoke rose in thin ribbons from the chimneys, carrying with it the scent of peat and the sweet tang of apples stewing somewhere behind shuttered windows. Joan Alderney stood outside the parish bakehouse, her sleeves rolled above her elbows, a dusting of flour marking her like a badge of reluctant duty. The bakehouse was a flurry of motion as women moved in and out with baskets of dough and sacks of spices purchased dear from London merchants. Inside, someone had crushed cinnamon bark with a mortar, and the scent clung to the air like a promise of warmth against the coming cold. Cinnamon was a luxury too expensive for most common tables, and yet for the Michaelmas fair, the parish elders had insisted on at least a few spiced cakes to impress visitors from neighboring villages. "Careful not to burn it, Joan," called Mistress Linley, bustling past with a tray. "Cinnamon scorches slower than honey, but faster than your patience." "I have patience enough," Joan said, though privately she doubted that very much. 2 years ago, she would not have been here among the flour-dusted aprons and gossip. Her father's cloth trade had once been respectable, bringing in bolts from Antwerp and turning a tidy profit. They had eaten fine then, with white flour and even a little sugar on feast days. But debts had a way of arriving like winter frost. Quietly at first, then all at once. When he died last winter, the tallyman came quickly, and the Alderney home had shrunk to 2 rooms above the tanner's yard. Now her mother spoke often and with increasing urgency of marriage. "A girl 24 cannot afford to be choosy," she said just that morning while tying her headscarf with brisk, practical movements. "The tanner's boy has a solid trade. He may not set your heart aflame, but neither will he leave you hungry." Joan had said nothing, but her stomach had nodded all the same. She preferred hunger to being bound to a man who smelled constantly of hides and lye, and yet she could feel time pressing on her like the weight of a damp cloak. A crash from within the bakehouse drew her back. A young boy had knocked over a bowl of dried apples, and they scattered across the flagstones. Laughter erupted as he scrambled to retrieve them before the hens could get to them. Joan bent to pick one up, brushing it off with her apron. "This is my life now," she thought. "Apples, flour, and the looming question of whose hearth I am meant to sit beside." Above her, the church bell tolled 9 times, deep and steady. The sound settled into her bones, familiar, anchoring, and for just a moment she let herself breathe in the scent of wood smoke and spice. Michaelmas had always meant endings and beginnings, the turning of the year. Perhaps, she thought, something could still begin for her, too. The clang of hammer on iron rang across the green like a heartbeat, steady and unhurried. Each strike echoed against the stone walls of the smithy, sending a few of the geese flapping in indignation near the pond. Villagers passed by the open forge with baskets and bundles, making a point not to stare too obviously at the man working within, though most of them failed. Thomas Blackwell had returned to Hartwell barely a fortnight ago, and already his presence had become one of the most discussed topics between the bakehouse and the church porch. He had been a lanky lad when he left, too tall for his sleeves and all elbows and hopeful dreams. Now he filled the space like a hearth fills a room, solid, warm, and with a constant undercurrent of danger in the firelight that danced across his arms as he worked. He lifted the glowing horseshoe with a pair of tongs, the metal red as a coal, and turned it with the ease of someone who had done the same motion 1,000 times. Sweat gathered in the hollow of his throat, and the soot across his cheek only made him look more like something carved from the forge itself. A girl carrying rushes tripped over her own feet watching him. He didn't seem to notice. Joan, meanwhile, had been sent with a basket of small loaves to trade, fresh bread for newly mended iron pots the parish needed for the fair. She approached the forge reluctantly, the heat hitting her like a wall. The smell of iron, horse, and smoke clung thick to the air. "Bread," she announced, setting the basket down on a nearby bench. "Mistress Linley says you'll want it before it goes cold." Thomas didn't look up at first. He plunged the horseshoe into the water and steam hissed up around them like a dragon exhaling. Only then did he glance her way. "So the bakehouse has started paying tribute to me," he said, a ghost of a grin on his lips. "I always thought it would end like this." "It's not a tribute," she replied, crossing her arms. "It's barter. You give the parish iron hooks. We give you bread. Nobody is crowning you king of Hartwell." He set the horseshoe aside to cool and stepped closer, wiping his hand on a cloth. "A shame. I thought I was making progress." She fought the urge to step back. "And you smell like cinnamon," he countered, eyeing the flower on her leaves. "Must be a grand life sprinkling sugar and spice while I'm here blistering my hands to keep folks in pots and horseshoes." She bristled. Not all of us had the luxury of vanishing off to London to chase glory. Something flickered in his expression, surprise, then something quieter. "Is that what they say, that I went to chase glory?" She hadn't meant it to sound bitter, or perhaps she had. "They say a lot," she said instead. He held her gaze, and for a heartbeat, the air between them felt charged in a way that had nothing to do with the forge. Then, from the road, a shout. "Blackwell, the tanner's lad broke his stirrup again." Thomas exhaled, the tension snapping like a cooling bar of an iron. Back to work, then. As he turned away, Joan caught sight of the sparks rising behind him like fireflies in the dusk. She told herself that it was only the forge light making her heart beat strangely. Only the forge light. The next morning dawned with a low mist crawling across the fields, turning the world silver and soft at the edges. Joan arrived at the parish green expecting another day of kneading dough and brushing cinnamon into tarts. Instead, she found half the bakehouse in disarray and Mistress Linley looking as though she'd like to fling her spice basket into the nearest pond. "Change of plans," the older woman said, bustling past with her skirts swishing like an angry swan. "The marchpane molds are still at Hartwell Manor's storehouse. They forgot to bring them down and the fair's tomorrow. The parish elder says someone must fetch them before noon." Joan blinked. "Can't one of the boys go?" "The boys are helping the reeve sort the goose feathers and have vanished conveniently into thin air," Mistress Linley said sharply. Then, with a sly narrowing of her eyes, "Besides, the chest is iron-bound, heavy. You'll need someone with arms." Before Joan could ask what that implied, a familiar clang rang from the lane. Thomas Blackwell strode past, a bucket of nails balanced effortlessly on one shoulder. Mistress Linley turned like a cat who had just spotted cream. "Blackwell," she called, "you're needed." He paused, and then when he saw Joan beside her, his brows lifted. "Am I?" Yes, Mistress Lindley said firmly. You and Mistress Alderney need to go to the manor storehouse and fetch the molds. The cart's already waiting. Off you go. Take the lower lane by the hedgerow. Less mud. Joan opened her mouth to protest, but Mistress Lindley was already gone in a flurry of cinnamon-scented indignation. Thomas gave a slow, almost amused nod. Seems we are drafted. Seems so, Joan said tightly. They set off down the lane, a small handcart creaking along behind them. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. Somewhere nearby, villagers were gathering blackberries from the last stubborn brambles, tongues already stained purple. A flock of crows took off from the church roof all at once, cawing like a warning. They walked in silence for a stretch, the wheels of the cart thumping over the roots. It was Thomas who finally broke it. I heard the tanner's son called on your mother yesterday, he said. She stiffened. You hear too much. I shoe the parish horses, he replied mildly. Horses stand near people. People talk. Let them talk. He glanced sideways at her. Do you want it? The match? Her laugh was short. I want space to choose something, someone. He was quiet for a moment, the forge smoke scent of him mingling with the damp hedgerow air. Before he could form a reply, Mistress Lindley's voice carried from behind them, not physically present, but summoned by the mere force of her gossip. They're saying, she had told the bakehouse that morning, that a merchant passing through from Bristol had with him a curious thing, a gourd, orange as a marigold from the New World. Some say you can mash it into a pie. Joan had rolled her eyes at the time. Now, walking beside Thomas, she repeated it aloud with a snort. A pie from an orange squash. Next, someone will say it can cure heartbreak. Thomas gave a low laugh. If it can do that, I'll forge it a silver spoon myself. Hartwell Manor stood at the edge of the village lands, its stone walls softened by moss and centuries of damp English autumns. The storehouse lay just beyond the main buildings, half covered in ivy and smelling faintly of grain, iron, and whatever spilled from the last harvest. Thomas set the cart down and pushed open the heavy door. It groaned in protest, the hinges old and in need of oil. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through narrow slits in the wall, catching dust motes that danced like ash in the air. There, Joan said, pointing to a stout iron-bound chest beneath a stack of unused rush mats. It looked heavy. Of course it did. Thomas gave a low whistle. They weren't exaggerating. That's not a chest. That's a siege weapon. She stepped forward without waiting for him, lifting one end experimentally. It barely budged. You'll pull something, he warned. That's why there are two of us, she said, stubbornness already tightening her jaw. He moved beside her. They crouched at the same moment, hands brushing for the briefest second where the iron straps met the corner. Joan pulled back as if the metal had scorched her. Thomas paused. I don't bite, you know. I didn't say you did. No, he said quietly. But you act as though getting too close might catch. She didn't answer, but she set her hands back on the chest, carefully this time. On 3, he said. 1, 2. They lifted. The chest groaned. Joan staggered a step, and Thomas reached instinctively, one arm bracing around her waist to steady her. For a moment, they stood still, the weight of the chest forgotten between them. The only sound was their breath and the faint tap of rain beginning against the storehouse roof. Joan stepped back first. We should just get it on the cart? Thomas nodded once and said nothing. They slid the chest onto the handcart, the iron scraping in a way that made Joan wince. Outside, the mist had thickened, turning the hedgerows into ghostly shapes. As they began the walk back, the cart creaking between them, Joan tried to steady the odd flutter in her chest. She focused on the practical. The fair starts at dusk, she said. They'll light the lanterns along the green. And there's dancing. Thomas said, rolling the cart with one hand. There's always dancing, she replied. Will you go? She hesitated. I'll be serving at the bakehouse stall. I doubt I'll have time. That wasn't the question. She didn't look at him. The tanner's son will likely ask. A beat of silence, then, with quiet humor, will you say yes? She opened her mouth, ready with a deflection, something about duty or her mother or the price of cinnamon. But the words tangled. From the road ahead came the distant sounds of laughter and someone practicing music for the fair. The cartwheels thumped rhythmically against the stones like a heartbeat. I don't know yet, she said at last. Thomas nodded once. Then I suppose, he said with a hint of something unreadable, there's still time. By late afternoon, Hartwell village had transformed. What only hours before had been a quiet lane of thatched roof and muddy boots was now threaded with garlands of rosemary and late marigolds, tied with strips of cloth dyed in whatever color the women could coax from their dye pots. Children chased each other between stalls, faces sticky with crabapple toffee. A lutenist turned his instrument near the ale cart, testing a new tune that made even the geese waddle with suspicion. Joan stood behind the bakehouse stall, arranging small rounds of spiced cake on a linen-covered board. The cinnamon dust shimmered faintly in the golden light. Behind her, the ovens still smoked from the day's hundreds of loaves, each one carted down by sweating teenagers who immediately vanished into the crowd the moment the duty was done. "Smile, dear," the widow Alderney murmured beside her, handing out small parcels of bread wrapped in cloth. "You look like you're preparing for an execution instead of a fair." "I'm smiling," Joan lied. "Your mouth is a straight line," her mother observed. "That is not a smile, that's a grimace with manners." Joan adjusted a tray to avoid answering. Nearby, Mistress Linley was in her element, ladling out spiced ale and shouting cheerfully about exotic cargoes from Bristol. "Cardamom!" she cried to a passerby, as though invoking a medieval spell. "Nutmeg, cinnamon, all the riches of the Levant in a single cup." Children clustered around her in fascination, though most of them had no idea what a Levant even was. Joan's gaze drifted past them, scanning the green. She told herself she wasn't looking for anyone. She was simply taking in the scene. Men had begun gathering near the ale cart, laughing too loudly. The tanner's son Will stood among them, already flushed with his first mug. He spotted her and lifted a hand in greeting that wobbled dangerously between a wave and a salute. Widow Alderney gave a pleased hum. "He looks at you kindly," she said. "He looks at everyone kindly when there's ale," Joan muttered under her breath. Before her mother could scold, a hush rippled through the nearby crowd, the kind that isn't exactly quiet but shifts the tone. People turned slightly, just enough to make space while pretending they weren't. Thomas Blackwell had arrived. He came without ceremony, no cloak despite the cooling air, sleeves rolled, and a smudge of soot still marking his forearm like an afterthought. He carried a stack of newly forged iron hooks slung over his shoulder, clearly meant for the roasting pit. But it wasn't the hooks that drew attention. It was the way he carried them, as though they weighed nothing, and the casual nod he gave to the lutenist, who immediately adjusted his rhythm as if the forge itself had stepped onto the green. Mistress Linley leaned in close to Joan, eyes sparkling with mischief that could light lanterns. "There's our blacksmith," she murmured, "back from London with smoke in his hair and opinions in his eyes." "I hadn't noticed," Joan said flatly. Mistress Linley did not dignify that with a response. Thomas set the hooks by the spit and exchanged a word with the reeve. Then, as though pulled by some unseen thread, his eyes lifted and found Joan's across the green. For the briefest moment, the noise of the fair seemed to recede like a breath drawn in before a song. And the goose stole one of Joan's spiced cakes, and the spell shattered in a honking chaos. The lutenist struck up a reel just as the sun dipped low, turning the sky the color of quince marmalade. Lanterns were being lit one by one along the trees that bordered the green, their glow catching in the mist still lingering from the morning. Couples began taking their places for the dance, a circle first, then partners, the usual pattern, the usual certainty. Joan busied herself wiping down the stall, though there was nothing really left to wipe. The spiced cakes were mostly gone, except for the sad, slightly pecked one that the goose had claimed and dropped in shame when chased. Widow Alderney gave her arm a gentle nudge. "Go," she said. "No man ever proposed to a tray of bread." "That's comforting," Joan said dryly. Her mother's face was soft but tired, a lifetime of hopes condensed into one brief look. "I only want you safe." Safe. The word hung there, reasonable and suffocating. The tanner's son Will made his approach. His hair was windblown, and his grin was the earnest grin of a man who's never been truly hurt by anything except perhaps a stubborn goat. He offered his hand a little too eagerly. "Dance?" he asked. It wasn't a bad hand. That was the problem. It was an entirely adequate hand. Joan glanced across the green almost involuntarily and saw Thomas speaking with the reeve near the roasting pit. He wasn't smiling. He was staring at the lanterns as though deciding whether to stay or disappear back into the forge. Will cleared his throat, reminding her that he was still there. Joan placed her hand in his. It was fine. Perfectly fine. They joined the circle and the dance began, a step, a turn, hands changing as tradition dictated. Will moved with the rhythm confidently, if a bit too enthusiastically. Joan's mind was already drifting somewhere else. Halfway through the second turn, the circle broke into pairs as expected. Will stepped forward to take her hand again, but fate, or perhaps the reeve's poor organizational skills, shifted the line. Thomas stepped out opposite her. He had not been in the circle a moment ago, and yet there he was. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, because the dance demanded it, they reached for each other. His hand was warm, calloused, steady. Joan forgot the next step entirely. "Left," Thomas said, quietly, guiding her with the smallest pressure of his hand. His voice held no mockery now, only something steady and quiet, like the forge before the flame roars. They turned. Lantern light flickered on his profile, strong lines softened by the shadow. Joan felt something uncoil in her chest, something she had kept laced tight for months. The circle turned again, and their hands slipped free now as new partners took their place. Will reappeared, beaming as if nothing had shifted, but something had. Along the ring of dancers and the lantern glow, Thomas Blackwell looked back once more. Not longing, not plea, just a silent promise that this, whatever this was not finished. The dance ended in a burst of applause and laughter, the lutenist bowing with a theatrical flourish before launching into another, louder tune for the younger lads who still had yet to exhaust their energy. Will escorted Joan back toward the bakehouse stalls, still chattering happily about the ale tent, the goose chase earlier, and whether rain would spoil tomorrow's festivities. Joan nodded when politeness demanded it. Her eyes, however, drifted again toward the forge. Thomas had already slipped away from the lantern light. She could see the faint red glow from the smithy across the green, a heartbeat of fire in the dark. "He dances well," she said, meaning Will. Her voice held approval, but not joy. "He's kind," Joan replied automatically. Her mother laid the cloth down and followed her gaze toward the faint flicker of the forge. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, quietly, "Your father used to say, a man who works with fire either learns gentleness or becomes the fire." Joan looked at her sharply. "What are you saying?" Widow Alderney gave a small shrug as though deciding how much to reveal. "I'm saying Will is a good man, good as bread, and bread keeps you alive." She paused, then added, softer, "But it does not set the table alight." It was the closest her mother had ever come to admitting that safety and joy were not the same thing. Before Joan could respond, Mistress Linley breezed past, cheeks flushed from spiced ale and victory over 3 separate arguments about the price of cinnamon. She gave Joan a knowing look. "If you're going to stare into the dark like a tragic ballad, at least take a coat. It's cold." "I'm not," Joan began. "Yes," Mistress Linley said, already walking away. "You are." Left with no further excuse, Joan wiped her hands and stepped away from the stall. Lantern light faded behind her as she crossed the green, her shoes whispering against the damp grass. The forge glowed ahead. Less bright now, the fire banked low, casting flickers of orange on the open doorway. She hesitated at the threshold. Inside, Thomas was alone, sleeves pushed up, working quietly with a smaller piece of metal, something delicate, no larger than his palm. The usual clang of the forge was absent. Instead, he moved with a careful patience she had not yet seen, turning the piece slowly in the light. He sensed her presence before he saw her. "Fair's not finished," he said without looking up. "No," she replied. I needed air." A pause. The fire popped softly. Then he asked, without turning, "Are you promised to him?" It was not a dramatic question. It was asked as though one might ask about the weather. Joan stepped inside fully, the warmth of the forge curling around her like a cloak. "No," she said simply. At that, Thomas finally looked at her, not surprised, but changed. The forge at night felt different than during the day. Without the bustle of villagers and the noise of the hammer strikes, it was almost gentle, like a sleeping beast, all heat without fury. The embers pulsed in the hearth, red and steady, casting long shadows that danced on the walls where horseshoes and tools hung in neat rows. Thomas set the small piece of iron gently on the workbench. Joan stepped closer, curious despite herself. "What is that?" "A mistake," he said at first, but then, more quietly, "or perhaps not." She moved until she could see it properly. It wasn't a tool or a hook. It was a little pan, crudely shaped, but clearly made with intention. Its surface had been flattened and gently curved, and on the handle he had begun to press a design with a small punch. A Tudor rose. Joan blinked. "You're forging bakeware now." He gave a small huff of laughter. "Mistress Linley said some merchant in Bristol brought back an orange thing from the New World. Said it could be cooked like a pie if one had the right pan." He tapped the little iron dish with a finger. "Figured I might as well be ready for the future." There was humor in his voice, but something else, too. A quiet kind of hope. Joan traced the edge of the pan with one fingertip. The metal was warm. "You made this in one evening." "Made," he said, "is a generous word. I hammered it into something almost useful and prayed it wouldn't fall apart." "It's ridiculous," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She hesitated, searching for a word that fit. "Hopeful." That made him go still. For a moment, neither spoke. Somewhere outside, the lutenist struck up another tune for the last of the dancers, the notes faint through the night air. Thomas leaned against the workbench, arms folded. "When I was in London," he said slowly, "I thought work in a royal armory would feel like purpose, like making something that mattered." He glanced at the glowing coals. "Turns out, making a single pan for a village I hardly care about feels more like purpose than a dozen swords for men whose names I never knew." Joan looked at him properly this time, not just at the soot and the firelight and the broad shoulders the villagers whispered about, but at the man who had come home from a place people were expected to want to stay, and found his purpose not in glory but in hearth fires and cinnamon and iron pans for imaginary pies. She realized, quietly without drama, that she did not want safety if it meant giving that up. Thomas reached out and held the little iron pan between them, the punched rose catching the light. "If that orange gourd ever finds its way here," he said, his tone light but his eyes very steady, "will you taste it with me?" Joan didn't look away. "Yes," she said, and it was not about gourds at all. By morning, the fair was only a memory, a few trampled garlands, the faint smell of cider, and ash where the roasting pit had been. The air was sharp and bright again, the kind of October light that makes every puddle look like polished pewter. Smoke lifted lazily from the chimneys, and somewhere a cock crowed late, as if even he had stayed up too long the night before. Joan walked down the lane with the first loaves from the bakehouse tucked beneath her arm. The world felt quieter, emptied of noise, but full of possibilities. A few villagers nodded as she passed, tired, smiling, still humming bits of the previous night's tune. When she reached the smithy, the door stood open. Thomas was already at work, though not at the anvil. He was scrubbing the floor with sand and water, sleeves rolled, humming under his breath. The forge was cool. He hadn't yet lit the fire. She set the loaves on the bench. "You'll have no customers if they think you've turned respectable." He looked up, startled, and then grinned. "Respectable? That's an insult where I come from." You've lived here your whole life. Exactly. He wiped his hand, then nodded toward the bench. You come to barter again? She shook her head. To return something. From beneath her shawl, she drew out the small pan he'd made, polished now, the rose on its handle catching the light. It belongs here, she said, until there's something worth baking in it. Thomas studied her, then the pan, then her again. Then it'll be empty a long while. Not as long as you think, she said lightly. Mistress Linley claims another ship from Bristol is due before All Hallows. If her tales are true, it carries more of those orange fruits. Then, he said, stepping closer, we'll need a recipe. I might invent one. She smiled, a real one this time, not her mother's polite half-curved. Something spiced, a little foolish. He reached out, brushing a flour smudge from her wrist. Then we'll call it Fool's Pie. That sounds like a sermon title. Or a promise. Outside, a gust of wind scattered the last of the leaves down the lane. The church bells began to ring for prime, steady and low. The year was turning. Soon the harvest would be over, the fields bare, and winter would creep toward them. But for now, the day smelled of smoke and apples and something new. Joan glanced toward the hills beyond Hartwell, where the mist was lifting. You'll light the forge soon? In a bit, Thomas said. Let the day warm first. She nodded, still holding the pan. Then I'll bring the spice. And with that simple sentence, as ordinary as the morning itself, the story ended the way Hallmark always promises it will. Not with a surprise, but with peace. 2 people, 1 village, a spark of warmth against the cold. The kind of ending you can see from a mile away and love all the more because of it. And there we have it, A Tudor Autumn Romance. No ghosts, no executions, no surprise betrayals, just cinnamon, questionable gourds, and a blacksmith with his emotional life sorted out by artisanal cookware. If you enjoyed this Tudorfied Hallmark experiment, let me know, because I have absolutely zero problem with writing an entire library of these. We could have a Yuletide at the manor, a Lenten love story with pickled fish, May Day mischief at the forge. Honestly, you guys, I could do this all day. So if this made you smile, or if you're now emotionally invested in the future of the pan and the potential arrival of the mysterious orange gourd from Bristol, hit that like button or just leave a comment saying spice and I will know what it means. Thank you for letting me try something new. Thank you for being here, for loving history in all of its ridiculous, wonderful forms. And I will be back again tomorrow with a proper podcast episode, actually on the potential heirs of Elizabeth in the early 1560s. That's a whole drama. So I will be back for that. In the meantime, my friend, have an amazing rest of your day and an amazing evening. And I will talk with you soon. Bye-bye.